I've always believed that Christmas morning should smell like cinnamon rolls and sound like children's laughter echoing through the house. That's how it was supposed to be in our family anyway. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. But as I stood in my sister Rebecca's kitchen that December morning, watching my 6-year-old daughter Emma clutch her cheek with tears streaming down her face, I realized some traditions are meant to be broken. The sound of Rebecca's hand connecting with Emma's face still rang in my ears, sharp and cruel as winter wind. My daughter's small voice asking, "Why did Aunt Becca hit me, Mommy?" would haunt me for weeks to come. But what happened next, what I discovered about my own life in the hours that followed, would change everything I thought I knew about who I was and why we lived the way we did. Because sometimes the people protecting you are closer than you think, and sometimes the life you're living isn't really yours at all. The morning started like every Christmas had for the past 7 years since Emma was born. David and I loaded the car with presents wrapped in bright red paper, Emma bouncing in her car seat, asking if Santa had visited Aunt Rebecca's house too. I remember adjusting the rearview mirror to catch her eyes, those wide brown eyes that looked so much like mine, sparkling with the kind of pure excitement that only children can manage. Our house in Denver had always felt like a sanctuary to me. David and I bought it 3 years after we married. A modest 2-story colonial with a wraparound porch and mature oak trees that turned brilliant gold every fall. I worked remotely for a cybersecurity firm, spending my days analyzing network vulnerabilities and writing code that kept hackers out of corporate systems. It was steady work that paid well enough for us to live comfortably without being flashy. David worked for a government contractor, something involving logistics and supply chain management that sounded boring enough that I never asked too many questions. We were the kind of family that neighbors waved to from their driveways, the kind that hosted 4th of July barbecues and always remembered to bring cookies to the school bake sale. Emma was thriving in 1st grade, her teacher constantly praising her reading skills and creative writing. Our biggest worries were whether to refinish the hardwood floors, and if Emma needed braces in a few years. That morning, driving through Denver's quiet suburban streets dusted with fresh snow, everything felt perfectly normal. David hummed along to Christmas music on the radio while I mentally ran through the list of presents we'd packed. Emma's new bicycle was already at Rebecca's house, hidden in the garage since last weekend. I'd spent hours the night before assembling a dollhouse that Emma had been begging for since October. Rebecca lived 20 minutes away in a newer development, where all the houses looked like they'd been cut from the same magazine page. Tall windows, 3-car garages, and front yards that stayed green year-round thanks to sprinkler systems and landscape services. She'd married her college boyfriend Marcus right out of university, and he'd built a successful accounting practice that afforded them the kind of lifestyle my parents had always dreamed of, but never achieved. I'd always felt a complicated mix of pride and inadequacy around Rebecca. She was 3 years older, the sister who'd gotten straight A's while I struggled with math, the one who'd been homecoming queen while I spent Friday nights reading science fiction novels. But she'd also been my protector when we were kids, the one who'd stood up to bullies and helped me with homework when our parents were too busy fighting about money to pay attention to either of us. When we pulled into Rebecca's circular driveway, I could already hear the chaos inside. Her twins, Jake and Jordan, were 4 years old and had the energy of caffeinated hurricanes. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Marcus answered the door in a sweater that looked like it cost more than my monthly grocery budget, his smile genuine, as he swept Emma up in a bear hug. The house smelled like brown sugar and vanilla, Rebecca's signature scent that she achieved through a combination of expensive candles and whatever she was always baking. The living room was immaculate despite the explosion of wrapping paper and toys that would inevitably happen within the hour. Rebecca appeared from the kitchen wearing a red dress that hugged her figure perfectly, her blonde hair styled in loose waves that had probably taken an hour to achieve. She hugged me tightly, and for a moment I was 8 years old again, grateful to have my big sister's attention. Rebecca had always been beautiful in an effortless way that made me feel like I was perpetually trying too hard. Today was no different. My own dark hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, my green sweater practical rather than fashionable. The morning unfolded with the familiar rhythm of family gatherings. Coffee for the adults, Hot chocolate for the kids, Marcus playing Santa, and distributing presents with theatrical flair. Emma's eyes lit up when she saw the bicycle, and she immediately wanted to try riding it in the house until Rebecca gently redirected her attention to the dollhouse. I should have noticed the tension earlier. Rebecca's smile was too bright, her laugh a little too sharp. She kept checking her phone and disappearing into the kitchen for longer than necessary. When I offered to help with lunch preparation, she waved me away more curtly than usual. The breaking point came just before noon. Emma had been playing quietly with her new dolls, creating elaborate storylines in the soft voice she used when she was completely absorbed in her imagination. Jake and Jordan had been roughhousing near the Christmas tree, despite repeated warnings from Marcus to settle down. I was in the kitchen with David, discussing whether we should drive to his parents' house the next day, when we heard Emma's startled cry from the living room. By the time I reached her, she was sitting on the floor surrounded by broken glass from an ornament, her face scrunched up in the way that meant tears were coming. Rebecca appeared as if she'd materialized from thin air, her face flushed with an anger that seemed disproportionate to the situation. Before I could assess what had happened or comfort Emma, Rebecca was standing over my daughter, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "Emma, what did you do? Those ornaments belong to my grandmother. You can't just touch things that don't belong to you." I moved toward Emma, already formulating the gentle explanation I'd give about accidents happening and how we'd help clean up together. But Rebecca's hand shot out faster than I could process, connecting with Emma's cheek with a sound that seemed to echo through the suddenly silent room. Emma's gasp was small and shocked, her hand flying to her face as tears spilled over. The red mark on her pale skin was immediate and unmistakable. For a moment, the room was frozen in a tableau of shock. Marcus stood in the doorway with his mouth open, the twins had gone quiet for perhaps the first time all morning, and David's coffee mug was halfway to his lips. My protective instincts kicked in with a fury I didn't know I possessed. I scooped Emma into my arms, feeling her small body trembling against mine as she buried her face in my shoulder. The rational part of my brain was trying to process what had just happened, while the maternal part was ready to burn the world down to protect my child. "Rebecca, what the hell is wrong with you?" The words came out in a low growl that didn't sound like my own voice. "She's 6 years old. It was an accident." Rebecca's face had gone pale, as if she was just realizing what she'd done, but instead of apologizing, she doubled down. "She needs to learn respect. You let her run wild, Sophia." Someone had to teach her boundaries. The accusation hit me like a physical blow. Emma was one of the most well-behaved children I knew, polite and thoughtful in ways that often surprised other adults. The suggestion that she was undisciplined, that I was failing as a mother, lit a fire in my chest that I'd never felt before. "Don't you dare," I said, my voice rising despite Emma's weight in my arms. "Don't you dare suggest that hitting my daughter was justified. What kind of person slaps a 6-year-old over a broken ornament?" David had moved to stand beside me, his hand resting protectively on Emma's back. His face had gone cold in a way I'd rarely seen, his usual easygoing demeanor replaced by something harder. Marcus stepped forward, his hands raised in a placating gesture. "Okay, everyone needs to take a breath here. Rebecca, that was completely out of line. Sophia, let's just calm down and talk about this rationally." But I was beyond rational. Emma's quiet sniffles against my neck were breaking my heart, and the red mark on her cheek was a visible reminder of my sister's inexcusable behavior. I couldn't stay in this house another minute. "We're leaving," I announced, already moving toward the front door. "Emma, we're going home, sweetheart. You didn't do anything wrong." Rebecca followed us, her voice pitched high with what might have been panic. "Sophia, wait. I'm sorry, okay? I'm stressed about work." And I just snapped. "It won't happen again." I turned back to face her, Emma still in my arms, and saw something in my sister's eyes that I couldn't quite identify. Fear, maybe, or desperation. But it wasn't enough to make me stay. "You're right, it won't happen again," I said coldly. "Because we won't be putting ourselves in a position where you can hurt my daughter again." David had already gathered our coats and Emma's presents, his movements efficient and purposeful. The drive home was quiet except for Emma's occasional hiccups as she calmed down from crying. I found myself checking the rearview mirror more often than usual, though I couldn't say why. Our house felt different when we walked through the front door. The familiar warmth was still there, the Christmas tree we'd decorated the weekend before still twinkling in the corner. But something had shifted. Emma went straight to her room to play with her new dollhouse, seemingly resilient in the way that children can be. But I couldn't shake the image of her small face crumpling in shock and pain. David made hot chocolate while I sat at our kitchen table, my hands wrapped around a mug that had long since gone cold. The events of the morning played on repeat in my mind, and I found myself analyzing Rebecca's behavior like I would a security breach at work. The tension, the overreaction, the way she'd seemed almost frantic when we left. Something wasn't right about today, I said finally, voicing what had been nagging at me since we left Rebecca's house. David looked up from where he was washing dishes, his expression careful. You mean beyond your sister, hitting Emma? I mean Rebecca's whole demeanor. She's always been high-strung, but this was different. She seemed scared, David. Like she was waiting for something bad to happen. He dried his hands methodically, not meeting my eyes. People act strange when they're stressed. You said she mentioned work problems. But that explanation felt insufficient. Rebecca had never mentioned work stress before, and as far as I knew, her job at a marketing firm was stable and well-suited to her skills. The more I thought about it, the more questions arose. Why had she been checking her phone so frequently? Why had Marcus seemed almost relieved when we left, despite the family drama? That evening, after Emma had fallen asleep clutching her new doll, I found myself staring out our living room window at the quiet street. Denver in December was peaceful, snow muffling the usual sounds of traffic and neighbors. Street lamps cast pools of warm light on the sidewalks, and I could see the multicolored glow of Christmas lights from houses up and down the block. It was exactly the kind of scene that had drawn David and me to this neighborhood when we were house hunting. Safe, family-friendly, the kind of place where children could ride their bikes in the street and neighbors knew each other's names. I'd felt so secure here, so certain that we'd found our permanent home. But standing at that window, I felt exposed in a way I couldn't explain. The street suddenly seemed too quiet, the shadows between houses too deep. When a car drove slowly past our house, something in my chest tightened with an anxiety that had no logical basis. David found me there an hour later, still staring out into the darkness. His arms came around me from behind, solid and reassuring. But even his embrace couldn't fully dispel the unease that had settled in my bones. You're overthinking this, he said gently, his voice rumbling against my back. Rebecca was out of line, but it's not the end of the world. Emma's fine, she's already forgotten about it. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to sink into his certainty and let it wash away the persistent feeling that something fundamental had changed today. But as we locked up the house and headed upstairs to bed, I found myself checking the deadbolt twice and making sure the security system was armed. That night, I dreamed of red handprints and breaking glass, of Emma's startled cry echoing through rooms that stretched endlessly in all directions. I woke just before dawn with my heart racing, David's arms still around my waist, our bedroom unchanged except for the gray light creeping around the edges of our curtains. But the feeling persisted through breakfast, through Emma's excited chatter about her dollhouse, through the ordinary rhythm of a post-Christmas morning. Something had been set in motion yesterday, and I couldn't shake the certainty that the slap was just the beginning. I was loading the dishwasher when the doorbell rang. David had taken Emma to the park to try out her new bicycle on the cleared paths, so I was alone in the house. Through the peephole, I could see two men in dark suits standing on our front porch, their postures alert and professional. My first thought was that they were salesmen or religious missionaries, the kind of unexpected visitors who always seemed to show up at inconvenient times. But something about their bearing made me hesitate. They stood like soldiers, shoulders back and eyes scanning our quiet street with a thoroughness that seemed excessive for door-to-door evangelists. I opened the door with the chain still attached, peering through the gap. "Can I help you?" The taller of the two men stepped forward slightly, his smile polite but not reaching his eyes. "Mrs. Sophia Martinez? We're here about the incident yesterday at your sister's house." My blood went cold, How could they possibly know about what happened at Rebecca's? We hadn't filed a police report, hadn't told anyone outside our immediate family. The only people who knew about the slap were the ones who'd witnessed it. "I'm sorry, who are you?" I asked, my hand automatically moving to close the door. "My name is Commander James Mitchell," the man said, producing a badge that looked official but unlike any police identification I'd ever seen. "I'm with Naval Intelligence. We need to discuss your family's security situation." Naval Intelligence. The words didn't make sense in the context of my quiet suburban life. David had served in the Navy before we met, but that was over a decade ago, and his current work was civilian. Emma and I had never had any connection to the military, beyond being a Navy wife and daughter. "I think you have the wrong house," I said, though my voice sounded uncertain even to my own ears. Commander Mitchell's expression became more serious. "Mrs. Martinez, yesterday's incident was not random. Your sister Rebecca has been under surveillance for the past 6 months, due to her involvement with individuals who pose a threat to national security. The altercation with your daughter was designed to force you to leave the house so that certain parties could assess your family's vulnerabilities." The words hit me like physical blows. Rebecca, under surveillance. National security threats. Emma's slap. Intentional rather than a moment of poor judgment. My legs felt suddenly weak, and I gripped the doorframe to steady myself. "That's impossible," I whispered. "Rebecca works in marketing. She's married to an accountant. They have nothing to do with anything dangerous." The second man, who had remained silent until now, spoke up. "Mrs. Martinez, may we come inside? This conversation requires privacy, and there are things about your husband's work that you need to understand." David's work. The boring government contractor job that I'd never questioned, because it seemed so mundane. Supply chain management and logistics, he'd always said. The kind of behind-the-scenes work that kept military operations running smoothly, but wasn't classified or dangerous. I found myself unlocking the chain and stepping back to let them in, my mind racing to process information that didn't fit with anything I thought I knew about my life. They moved through our living room with the practiced awareness of people accustomed to assessing threats, their eyes taking in details that I'd never considered security relevant. Commander Mitchell sat on the edge of our couch, his posture remaining formal despite the casual setting. "Mrs. Martinez, your husband David has been working in cybersecurity for the Department of Defense for the past 8 years. His official cover as a civilian contractor was designed to protect your family's identity, but recent developments have compromised that security. Cybersecurity. The same field I worked in, but for the military rather than private corporations." The irony would have been amusing under different circumstances. My husband and I had been doing similar work without my knowledge. Him protecting government networks while I secured corporate ones. Why wasn't I told? The question came out sharper than I intended, anger beginning to cut through the shock. "Because your own background made you a potential target," the second man said. "Your work with Nexus Cybersecurity has given you access to systems and vulnerabilities that foreign intelligence services would pay considerable sums to exploit. Keeping you unaware of David's real work was intended to maintain plausible deniability if you were ever approached. Nexus Cybersecurity. My employer for the past 5 years. The company I'd assumed was just another mid-sized firm serving corporate clients. But as the implications of what he was saying sank in, I realized that some of the systems I'd worked on had seemed unusually sophisticated, the security protocols more stringent than typical business applications would require. The incident with your sister yesterday was a test," Commander Mitchell continued. "Rebecca has been recruited by a foreign intelligence cell operating in the Denver area. They've been using her to gather information about your family's routines and vulnerabilities. The confrontation was designed to provoke an emotional response that would reveal information about your security awareness and response protocols." I thought about Rebecca's behavior, the tension and phone checking, the way she'd seemed to be performing rather than genuinely angry. Had every interaction been calculated? Had my sister, the woman who'd protected me as a child, been actively working to put my family in danger? Where are David and Emma now? I asked, sudden panic rising in my chest. "They're safe," the second man assured me quickly. We have a team maintaining surveillance on their location. But Mrs. Martinez, we need you to come with us immediately. Your cover has been blown, and staying in this house puts your family at continued risk." The speed with which my normal life was dissolving felt surreal. An hour ago, my biggest concern had been whether Emma's new bicycle was the right size. Now I was being told that everything I thought I knew about my family's life was an elaborate fiction designed to protect us from threats I'd never imagined. "I need to call David," I said, reaching for my phone. Commander Mitchell's hand moved to stop me. "Mrs. Martinez, all electronic communications are being monitored. Any attempt to contact your husband through normal channels will alert the people who are hunting your family to our current location." Hunting. The word sent ice through my veins. People were hunting my family, and I'd been living in complete ignorance of the danger surrounding us. Emma's innocent excitement about Christmas morning, David's casual humming in the car, my own focus on work deadlines and household routines, all of it had been happening against a backdrop of surveillance and threat assessment that I'd never suspected. "What do you need me to do?" I asked, surprised by how steady my voice sounded when everything inside me felt like it was falling apart. "Pack a bag with essentials only," Commander Mitchell said, standing. "Documents, medications, one change of clothes. Nothing electronic, nothing that could be traced. We have 15 minutes before we need to move." 15 minutes to pack up a life I was just learning had never been real. I moved through our house like a sleepwalker, gathering Emma's asthma inhaler, our passports from the safe David thought I didn't know about, a few changes of clothes that seemed inadequate for whatever was coming next. Standing in Emma's room, looking at the dollhouse she'd been so excited about just that morning, I felt the full weight of what was happening settle on my shoulders. My daughter was 6 years old, and her life was about to change in ways I couldn't explain or protect her from. The normal childhood I'd thought I was providing had been an illusion, and now that illusion was crumbling around us. As I zipped up the small suitcase, I caught sight of myself in Emma's bedroom mirror. I looked like the same woman who'd woken up that morning. But everything fundamental about who I was and what my life meant had shifted. I was no longer just Sophia Martinez, cybersecurity analyst and suburban mom. I was someone whose sister had betrayed her, whose husband had been lying for years, whose child was in danger from threats she couldn't understand. Commander Mitchell appeared in the doorway. "It's time, Mrs. Martinez." I took one last look around the room that had been Emma's sanctuary, with its pale yellow walls and the growth chart David had painted on the closet door. Then I followed him downstairs and out of the house that had never been as safe as I'd believed. The car waiting outside was unremarkable, a dark sedan that could have belonged to any of our neighbors. But as we pulled away from the curb, I turned to watch our house disappear behind us, knowing with absolute certainty that we would never be coming back. The safe house wasn't what I expected. After 40 minutes of driving through increasingly rural Colorado terrain, we pulled up to what looked like an abandoned ranch property, complete with weathered barn siding and a gravel driveway that hadn't seen maintenance in years. But the moment Commander Mitchell used his keycard on what appeared to be a rusted door handle, I realized that appearances were deliberately deceiving. Inside, the facility was a maze of clean corridors, humming electronics, and personnel who moved with the quiet efficiency of people accustomed to crisis situations. They led me through security checkpoints that scanned everything from my fingerprints to my retinas, processes that should have felt invasive but somehow felt like the first real safety I'd experienced since leaving Rebecca's house yesterday. A woman in civilian clothes who introduced herself only as Agent Carter escorted me to a briefing room where David was already waiting. The relief at seeing him was so overwhelming that I nearly collapsed. He stood immediately when I entered, pulling me into an embrace that felt like coming home after being lost in a foreign country. "Where's Emma?" were the first words out of my mouth. "Safe," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "She's in a secure facility about 20 miles from here, with people trained to take care of children in these situations. She thinks she's at a special camp while Mommy and Daddy handle some work things." The fact that there were people specifically trained to care for children in witness protection scenarios drove home just how far outside Normal life we'd fallen. This wasn't a temporary inconvenience or a misunderstanding that would be cleared up with a few phone calls. This was a complete upheaval of everything we'd built together. Agent Carter gestured for us to sit at a conference table equipped with screens and communication equipment that looked like something from a spy movie. The absurdity of the situation might have been funny under different circumstances. Here I was, a woman who'd spent the morning loading a dishwasher and worrying about whether Emma's new bicycle needed training wheels, now sitting in a government facility receiving briefings about national security threats. Before we go any further, Agent Carter began, I need to explain exactly what we're dealing with and how your family became involved. She activated one of the screens, displaying a photograph of Rebecca that looked like it had been taken with a telephoto lens. My sister was standing outside a coffee shop I didn't recognize, talking to a man in an expensive suit who looked Middle Eastern. The timestamp showed it was from 3 weeks ago. Your sister Rebecca has been in contact with operatives from the Quds Force, the international arm of Iran's Revolutionary Guard Corps. These are not amateur criminals or opportunistic hackers. They're highly trained intelligence professionals with resources that most people can't imagine. The words felt unreal. Rebecca, who spent her weekends at Target and complained about the price of organic groceries, involved with Iranian intelligence operatives. The woman who'd helped me pick out my wedding dress and thrown Emma's first birthday party was apparently living some kind of double life that I'd never suspected. How long has this been going on? David asked, his voice tight with the kind of controlled anger I'd rarely heard from him. We've been tracking her communications for 6 months, but her recruitment likely began over a year ago. The approach was sophisticated, beginning with what appeared to be a legitimate business opportunity. Rebecca was contacted by someone claiming to represent international marketing clients who needed help with campaigns targeting American demographics. Agent Carter clicked to the next slide, showing financial records that made my stomach drop. Deposits to Rebecca's personal account that were far larger than anything her marketing job could justify. Payments that had been carefully structured to avoid triggering automatic banking reports, but were still substantial enough to significantly improve her family's lifestyle. The money started small, Agent Carter continued, a few thousand here and there for consultation work that seemed legitimate. But as Rebecca became more dependent on the income, the requests became more specific. Information about her family members, their work schedules, their routines. Details about your husband's employment, your own work with Nexus Cybersecurity. I thought about all the family dinners where Rebecca had asked casual questions about our lives. Where we were planning to vacation, whether David traveled for work, what kind of projects I was working on. Conversations I'd assumed were normal sibling interest had apparently been intelligence-gathering operations. The breaking point came when they asked her to engineer a situation that would allow them to assess your family's security awareness, Agent Carter said. The Christmas gathering was the perfect opportunity. Rebecca was instructed to create a confrontation that would provoke you to leave quickly, allowing their surveillance team to observe your response protocols. David's hand found mine under the table, his grip tight enough to communicate the depth of his own shock. So the slap was planned? Not the specific action, but some kind of dramatic incident was required. Rebecca was told to create a situation serious enough that you would leave immediately, but not so severe that you would involve law enforcement. Hitting Emma accomplished that goal perfectly. The clinical analysis of my daughter's pain made me feel sick. Emma's tears, her confusion about why her aunt had hurt her, had been calculated components of an intelligence operation. The red mark on her cheek had been collateral damage in a game whose rules I was only beginning to understand. But why us? I asked. We're not important enough to justify this kind of effort. Agent Carter exchanged a look with Commander Mitchell before responding. Actually, you are. Both of you. David's work with classified cybersecurity systems makes him a high-value target, but your position at Nexus Cybersecurity is equally valuable to foreign intelligence services. She clicked to another screen, showing a network diagram that looked disturbingly familiar. It was the system architecture for one of the projects I'd been working on for the past 8 months. A comprehensive security overhaul for what I'd been told was a large financial services company. Mrs. Martinez, The client you've been working with isn't a private corporation. Nexus Cybersecurity was contracted by the Department of Defense to upgrade cybersecurity protocols for military financial systems. Your work over the past year has given you detailed knowledge of vulnerabilities and security measures protecting billions of dollars in defense spending. The room felt like it was tilting. Every late night I'd spent debugging code, every security protocol I'd designed and implemented had been protecting military assets rather than corporate profits. The sophisticated requirements that had sometimes puzzled me, the security clearances that had seemed excessive for business applications, suddenly made perfect sense. "How long have you known about my work?" I asked David, dreading the answer. His expression was pained. "I've known about your real client since you started the project. But Sophia, I couldn't tell you. The compartmentalization was designed to protect both of us. If either of us was compromised, the other could maintain operational security." Operational security. The phrase sounded strange coming from the man who helped Emma with her homework and remembered to buy milk on his way home from work. But looking at him now, I could see hints of the person he'd been hiding. The way he'd moved through our house that morning, checking windows and locks with professional thoroughness. His calm reaction to the news about Rebecca's betrayal, as if part of him had been expecting something like this. "There's more," Agent Carter said, and the gravity in her voice made my chest tighten with anticipation. The intelligence Rebecca gathered was used to plan a more comprehensive operation. "We have reason to believe that yesterday's incident was a precursor to a kidnapping attempt." The word hit me like ice water. Kidnapping. Not just surveillance or information gathering, but actual physical harm to my family. The casual way Agent Carter delivered this information suggested that kidnapping was a routine consideration in her world. But for me, it was a possibility so far outside normal experience that I couldn't fully process it. "Emma," I whispered, "would have been the primary target," Commander Mitchell confirmed. A 6-year-old child is an extremely effective leverage tool against parents who have access to sensitive information. The plan was likely to take her during a routine activity like school pickup or a playground visit, then demand information about defense cybersecurity systems in exchange for her safe return. I thought about all the ordinary moments when Emma had been vulnerable. Walking to the school bus stop, playing in our backyard, riding her bicycle in our quiet neighborhood. Any of those normal childhood activities could have been the moment when our lives were destroyed by people who saw my daughter as nothing more than a useful tool. "But how did they know so much about our routines?" David asked. Agent Carter pulled up another screen showing surveillance photographs that made my blood run cold. Pictures of Emma getting off the school bus, of me grocery shopping, of David leaving our house for work. The images had been taken with professional equipment from positions that suggested long-term observation. "Your sister provided detailed intelligence about your family's daily patterns, but they also conducted independent surveillance to verify and supplement her information. We've identified at least 3 separate teams that have been watching your family over the past 2 months. 3 teams. Professional intelligence operatives had been watching my child for 2 months, while I went about my daily life completely unaware. I thought about the times I'd felt vaguely uneasy walking to my car, the moments when I'd sensed someone watching but dismissed it as paranoia. My instincts had been trying to warn me, but I'd been too embedded in the illusion of suburban safety to listen. The operation was scheduled to begin today, Agent Carter continued. Rebecca's role was to provide real-time intelligence about your family's location and activities during the post-Christmas period, when routines are typically disrupted. The confrontation yesterday served multiple purposes. It gave them current information about your security awareness, it established Rebecca's continued access to your family, and it created emotional instability that would make you easier targets. Emotional instability. They'd calculated that the trauma of yesterday's incident would make us less capable of protecting ourselves. Emma's tears and confusion, my own anger and bewilderment, David's careful attempts to hold our family together while processing his own shock, all of it had been anticipated and factored into their planning. "So what happens now?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. "Now you disappear," Commander Mitchell said simply. "Complete identity change, relocation to a secure area, New employment that maintains your skill sets while keeping you away from sensitive projects. It's not witness protection exactly, but it functions similarly. Disappear. The word carried implications that were almost too large to contemplate. Emma's school friends, my job, the house we'd bought with such careful consideration of the neighborhood and schools. David's parents, who lived 2 hours away and called every Sunday to check on Emma. All the connections that made up our life would have to be severed. What about Rebecca? The question came out more bitter than I'd intended. Your sister will be arrested within the next 48 hours on charges related to espionage and conspiracy against the United States. The evidence we've gathered during our investigation is comprehensive enough to ensure a lengthy prison sentence. Part of me felt satisfied by this news, but a larger part felt hollow. Rebecca was going to prison, her children would grow up with a mother behind bars, and Marcus would have to rebuild his life around the knowledge that his wife had been living a lie. The ripple effects of her choices would destroy multiple families. Agent Carter leaned forward, her expression becoming more personal. Mrs. Martinez, I know this is overwhelming. Most people never have to confront the reality that their entire life has been built around intelligence operations and national security considerations. But I need you to understand that your family is genuinely in danger, and these protective measures aren't optional. The finality in her voice made it clear that this wasn't a discussion or negotiation. Our old life was over whether we cooperated or not. The only choice was whether we participated in building a new one or remained targets for people who saw us as useful assets to be acquired or eliminated. When do we see Emma? David asked. Tomorrow morning, after we've completed the initial security briefings and identity documentation. She'll be told that you're all starting a new adventure together, moving to a place where Daddy's work will be more exciting, and Mommy will have new projects to work on. A new adventure. The euphemism was probably appropriate for a 6-year-old, but the reality was that Emma would lose her friends, her school, her bedroom, with the growth chart on the closet door. She'd adapt, because children are resilient, but she'd also carry questions about why her aunt had hurt her, and why everything familiar had suddenly disappeared from her life. The next several hours passed in a blur of paperwork, briefings, and medical examinations that I hadn't known were part of the process. They took photographs for new identification documents, collected hair and DNA samples for security databases, and conducted psychological evaluations to assess how well we might adapt to life under assumed identities. The psychologist, a woman about my age who spoke with the kind of calm authority that suggested extensive experience with families in crisis, explained that the adjustment period typically lasted 6 to 18 months. Some people thrived with the opportunity to reinvent themselves, while others struggled with the loss of their original identity. The key factor, she explained, is usually how well the family unit maintains cohesion through the transition. Children adapt more easily when their parents present the change as positive and exciting rather than traumatic and frightening. By evening, David and I were alone in a small apartment within the secure facility. The space was comfortable but impersonal, like an extended stay hotel room designed by people who understood function but not comfort. We sat on the couch that might have been ordered from any furniture catalog, trying to process everything we'd learned. "Did you suspect about Rebecca?" I asked him. He was quiet for a long time before answering. No, I knew there were threats related to our work, but I assumed they were abstract, theoretical possibilities. Foreign intelligence services trying to hack systems or recruit assets in general. I never imagined it would be someone in our family. The betrayal felt deeper than just Rebecca's involvement with foreign operatives. It was the realization that the life we'd built together had been constructed around secrets and lies that I'd never consented to. David had been protecting me by keeping me ignorant, but the protection had also been a form of control. "Are you angry?" he asked. I considered the question seriously. Was I angry that he'd hidden his real work from me? That my own employer had been misleading me about the nature of my projects? That Rebecca had been systematically gathering intelligence about our family for over a year? "I'm angry at the situation," I said finally. "I'm angry that we never got to make informed choices about the risks we were taking. But I'm not angry at you specifically. You were trying to protect Emma and me in the best way you knew how." That night, lying in a bed that smelled faintly of industrial detergent, I stared at the ceiling and tried to imagine what our new life would look like. Would we live in a small town where everyone knew everyone else's business? making it impossible for strangers to blend in? Would Emma go to school under a different name, learning to answer to something other than the name we'd chosen for her when she was born? David's breathing had settled into the deep rhythm of sleep, but I remained wide awake, my mind cycling through practical questions that had no easy answers. What happened to our house? Would our neighbors wonder where we'd gone? What story would they be told about the family that had simply vanished overnight? Somewhere in the distance, I could hear the hum of equipment and the occasional sound of footsteps in the corridor outside our door. People were working through the night to arrange the details of our disappearance, creating the paperwork and digital footprints that would allow us to exist as different people in a different place. The morning brought a meeting with specialists in identity management who explained the practical aspects of becoming someone else. New social security numbers, employment histories that would stand up to routine, background checks, educational records that matched our actual qualifications but were attributed to different institutions. They'd chosen the name Sarah Chen for me, a decision based on my appearance and the demographic profile of the area where we'd be relocated. David would become Michael Chen, and Emma would be Lucy Chen. The names felt foreign in my mouth when I practiced using them, like clothes that didn't quite fit. The key to successful identity adoption, explained the specialist, a man who looked like he'd spent his entire career helping people disappear, is consistency and commitment. You have to think of yourselves as the Chen family, not as the Martinez family pretending to be the Chens. Emma was brought to us just before lunch, bouncing with the kind of energy that suggested she'd viewed her night away from us as an exciting sleepover, rather than a traumatic separation. The sight of her face, unmarked now by yesterday's incident, made my chest tight with relief and renewed determination to protect her from any further harm. "Mommy! Daddy! Guess what? They have a whole playground here, and I met a girl named Stephanie who knows how to braid friendship bracelets, and we had pancakes for breakfast with real maple syrup." Her enthusiasm was both heartbreaking and encouraging. If she could find joy in an underground government facility, maybe she'd be able to adapt to whatever came next. But watching her excitement, I also felt the weight of responsibility for maintaining that resilience through whatever challenges lay ahead. The drive to our new location took most of the afternoon, through mountain passes and small towns that looked like postcard versions of rural America. Our destination was a city in Oregon that I'd never visited, large enough to offer anonymity, but small enough that newcomers were noticed and welcomed, rather than ignored. As we crossed the state line, David reached over and took my hand. "Whatever happens," he said quietly, "we're doing this together." I squeezed his fingers and looked back at Emma, who had fallen asleep clutching her new doll and the small bag of belongings that represented everything familiar she had left. Tomorrow we would start building a life as the Chen family, and I had no idea what that life would look like or how long it would last. But for the first time since Rebecca's hand had connected with Emma's cheek, I felt something that might have been hope. We were alive, we were together, and we were moving toward a future that was uncertain, but not predetermined. Whatever came next, we would face it as a family, and maybe that would be enough. The apartment they'd arranged for us in Portland was supposed to feel like home within a few weeks. That's what the relocation specialist had promised anyway. Clean lines, neutral colors, and furniture that looked like it had been selected by someone who understood comfort, but had never actually lived in a space long enough to make it personal. I stood in the living room on our first morning as the Chen family, holding a cup of coffee that tasted wrong because even the brand was different from what I'd been drinking for years. Emma was exploring her new bedroom, her voice carrying through the thin walls as she narrated an elaborate story involving her dolls and their adjustment to their new house. Her resilience continued to amaze me, but I could hear the slight edge in her chatter that suggested she was working harder than usual to maintain her cheerful demeanor. David had left early for his first day at his new job, something involving network security for a regional bank that was legitimate but far removed from the classified work he'd been doing. The cover story was that we'd moved to Portland for better career opportunities and lower cost of living, a narrative that was common enough to avoid suspicion, but vague enough to discourage detailed questions. My own employment wouldn't begin for another week, giving me time to establish Emma in her new school and settle into our assumed identities. The waiting felt dangerous somehow, as if idle time might allow the fabricated nature of our lives to become apparent. I found myself checking locks obsessively and studying the faces of strangers on the street, looking for signs that we'd been discovered. It was on the third day, while Emma was at school and I was grocery shopping with a list written in careful handwriting that belonged to Sarah Chen rather than Sophia Martinez, that the first crack appeared in our new reality. I was reaching for pasta sauce when I heard a familiar voice from the next aisle over. "Excuse me, are you Sophia Martinez?" I turned to see a woman about my age, someone I recognized but couldn't immediately place. My heart rate spiked as I tried to remember the protocols Agent Carter had drilled into us about encountering people from our previous life. Deny, deflect, and disengage. Never admit to recognition, never provide information that could confirm identity. "I'm sorry, I think you have me confused with someone else," I said, forcing my voice to remain steady. "I'm Sarah Chen." The woman's expression shifted from friendly recognition to confusion, then to something that might have been suspicion. "Oh, I'm so sorry. You look exactly like someone I used to work with in Denver. The resemblance is remarkable." She was from Nexus Cybersecurity, I realized. Jennifer something. From the accounting department. We'd shared small talk by the coffee machine and compared notes about working from home during the pandemic. Now she was studying my face with the intensity of someone trying to solve a puzzle. "People say I have one of those faces," I replied, already backing toward the end of the aisle. "If you'll excuse me, I need to finish shopping." But as I walked away, I could feel her watching me, and I knew with sick certainty that the encounter had been anything but casual. Jennifer had recognized me despite the different hair color and style that the image specialists had recommended. The facial recognition software that employers used for security badges would have no trouble making the same identification. I abandoned my shopping cart and left the store immediately, my hands shaking as I started the car. The safe phone they'd given me had a single programmed number for emergencies, but what qualified as an emergency? A chance encounter with a former colleague in a grocery store might be coincidence, or it might be the beginning of the end of our carefully constructed new life. At home, I tried to convince myself that I was overreacting. Portland was a major city, and people moved here from all over the country for work opportunities. It wasn't impossible that Jennifer had relocated for reasons that had nothing to do with tracking down Sophia Martinez. But the rational explanation felt thin compared to the weight of paranoia that had settled in my chest. That evening, David noticed my agitation immediately. Emma was in her room, supposedly doing homework but actually playing with her dolls, when I told him about the grocery store encounter. His expression grew progressively more serious as I described Jennifer's reaction, and the feeling that our cover had been blown after less than a week. "Did you use the emergency contact?" he asked. I wasn't sure if it qualified. It might have been completely innocent. David was quiet for a long moment, staring out our living room window at the street below. The apartment was on the third floor of a building that had been chosen specifically for its security features. But suddenly the height felt insufficient, and the windows felt like vulnerabilities rather than sources of natural light. "Sophia?" he said, then caught himself. "Sarah, we need to call them. Even if it turns out to be nothing, they need to know that someone from your old job is in the area." The conversation with Agent Carter was brief and professional, but I could hear the concern in her voice despite her attempts to maintain a neutral tone. She asked detailed questions about the encounter, Jennifer's demeanor, and whether I'd noticed anyone else who might have been conducting surveillance. By the time I hung up, David and I both understood that our honeymoon period as the Chen family was over. "They want us to maintain normal routines while they investigate," I told him. "But if there's any indication that our location has been compromised, we'll need to move again." Move again. The phrase carried implications that neither of us wanted to examine too closely. How many times could we uproot Emma's life before the constant disruption caused permanent damage? How many identities could we cycle through before we lost track of who we'd originally been? The next morning brought news that confirmed our worst fears. Agent Carter called while Emma was getting ready for school, her voice carrying the kind of controlled urgency that meant the situation had escalated beyond coincidence and speculation. "Mrs. Chen," she said, using our assumed name with the kind of precision that suggested she'd been practicing. "We've confirmed that Jennifer Walsh is not in Portland by coincidence. She was recruited by the same intelligence network that compromised your sister, and her presence in your vicinity represents an immediate threat to your family's security." Jennifer Walsh. I'd never known her last name during our brief workplace interactions, but hearing it now made the danger feel specific and personal. Someone I'd shared casual conversation with about weekend plans and television shows had been turned into an asset for foreign intelligence operatives. How long has she been working for them? I asked. We're still determining the timeline, but her recruitment likely began shortly after your disappearance from Denver. The intelligence network realized they'd lost access to you and began systematically approaching people from your professional and personal circles. The systematic nature of the approach was what frightened me most. This wasn't opportunistic or improvised. Someone had made lists of people who knew Sofia Martinez, researched their vulnerabilities and motivations, and developed recruitment strategies tailored to each individual. The operation was professional and patient in ways that suggested significant resources and long-term planning. What happens now? David asked. He'd been listening to my side of the conversation, and his expression suggested he'd already reached the same conclusions I had about the implications. Immediate relocation to a secondary safe house while we assess the extent of the compromise. Pack only essential items. A team will be at your location within the hour. An hour. I looked around the apartment that had been our home for less than a week, at Emma's backpack sitting by the door ready for another day of school, at the coffee maker I'd finally figured out how to program. None of it belonged to us, but it had begun to feel familiar in the way that temporary spaces do when you're trying to build a life. Emma took the news about moving again better than I'd expected, though I could see the strain in the way she clutched her favorite doll and asked repeated questions about whether her new school friends would miss her. The story we told her about Daddy's work requiring another move seemed thinner this time, and I wondered how many more relocations she could accept before demanding explanations we couldn't provide. The secondary safe house was a cabin in the mountains east of Portland, isolated enough that visitors would be noticed immediately but close enough to the city that evacuation routes remained viable. The drive took 2 hours through increasingly remote terrain, past signs for hiking trails and fishing spots that belonged to a version of American life I'd never experienced. Agent Carter met us at the cabin personally, a departure from protocol that suggested the situation had become more serious than routine security measures could address. She looked like she'd been working without sleep, her usually crisp appearance replaced by the kind of exhaustion that comes from managing multiple crisis situations simultaneously. Before we discuss next steps, she said, there's additional information about your sister's involvement that you need to understand. She led us to a table covered with documents and photographs that had the clinical precision of a law enforcement investigation. Rebecca's face appeared in dozens of surveillance images, meeting with people I didn't recognize in locations that ranged from coffee shops to hotel lobbies to parking garages. Your sister's cooperation with foreign intelligence services was more extensive than we initially realized, Agent Carter began. She didn't just provide information about your family, she actively recruited other assets within her social and professional networks. The photographs showed Rebecca with people I recognized, Marcus's business partner from his accounting firm, the neighbor who lived 3 houses down from them and organized the annual block party, Emma's piano teacher, who had seemed so devoted to helping children develop their musical abilities. How many people? David asked, his voice strained. 17 confirmed recruits over the past 18 months. Your sister was exceptionally effective at identifying people with financial pressures or personal vulnerabilities that made them susceptible to recruitment. She received substantial bonuses for each successful asset development. Bonuses. Rebecca had been paid extra for destroying the lives of people who trusted her. The piano teacher who had always been patient with Emma's struggles with rhythm, the neighbor who brought soup when anyone on the block was sick, Marcus's business partner who had helped them navigate tax complications during a difficult year. All of them had been turned into intelligence assets by my sister. But why target so many people? I asked. What could they possibly gain from a suburban neighborhood in Denver? Agent Carter's expression became even more serious. Because it wasn't just about your neighborhood. Your sister was part of a much larger operation, designed to infiltrate American communities and establish long-term intelligence networks. The goal wasn't immediate information gathering, but the creation of sleeper assets who could be activated for future operations. Sleeper assets. The term belonged to spy novels and Cold War history, not to piano teachers and accountants in suburban Denver. But the evidence spread across the table showed a systematic effort to embed foreign intelligence operatives within the fabric of ordinary American communities. The revelation came when we arrested your sister. Agent Carter continued. She provided comprehensive information about the network in exchange for consideration regarding charges against her family. Her cooperation allowed us to identify and apprehend most of the other assets, but it also revealed the scope of the operation. I thought about Marcus and the twins, Rebecca's family, who had presumably been living normal lives while she conducted intelligence operations from their suburban home. The twins who had been roughhousing by the Christmas tree while their mother planned operations that could have resulted in Emma's kidnapping. "Where is Rebecca now?" I asked. "Federal custody. She's been cooperative, but the information she's provided has made it clear that your family's situation is more dangerous than we initially assessed. The intelligence network views you as high-value targets not just because of your work, but because of what you represent. What we represented." The phrase suggested implications beyond individual targeting, something broader and more systematic than personal threat assessment. "The network has been specifically tasked with identifying and compromising American families involved in cybersecurity and defense work," Agent Carter explained. "Your family represents a proof of concept for their operations. If they can successfully eliminate or turn a family like yours, it demonstrates their capability to target similar families throughout the country." Eliminate or turn. The clinical language couldn't disguise the reality that someone had made a decision about whether my family would be killed or converted into intelligence assets. Emma's future had been reduced to operational considerations by people who had never met her but had studied her daily routines and identified her vulnerabilities. David's hand found mine under the table, his grip tight enough to communicate the depth of his own shock and fear. We'd known our situation was dangerous, but the revelation that we were part of a larger systematic attack on American families felt like a different category of threat entirely. "So what happens to us now?" I asked. Agent Carter gathered the photographs and documents, stacking them with the kind of methodical precision that suggested she'd delivered similar briefings to other families in similar situations. Long-term relocation with enhanced security protocols. New identities that are more comprehensive than what we initially provided. Integration into a community that's specifically designed to protect families like yours. A community designed to protect families like ours. The phrase suggested that we weren't the only ones, that somewhere there was a place where other families were living under assumed identities, trying to build normal lives while being protected from intelligence networks that viewed them as targets or assets. That night, lying in the unfamiliar bed in the mountain cabin, I listened to Emma's breathing from the next room and tried to imagine what our lives would look like in whatever community Agent Carter had described. Would Emma grow up knowing that her real name was Emma Martinez rather than Lucy Chen? Would she understand why her parents had chosen protection over the ordinary life she'd been promised? The weight of the choices we'd been forced to make felt crushing in the darkness. Rebecca's betrayal had set everything in motion, but the implications reached far beyond our immediate family. 17 other families were dealing with their own versions of discovery and upheaval. Children were losing their sense of safety and normalcy because adults they trusted had made decisions that prioritized money over loyalty. David's breathing had settled into the rhythm of exhausted sleep, but I remained awake, staring at the ceiling and trying to process the magnitude of what we'd learned. Tomorrow would bring new decisions about our future, new choices about how to protect Emma while trying to maintain some version of the childhood she deserved. But tonight, in the silence of the mountain cabin, I finally understood that our old life wasn't temporarily disrupted or postponed. It was gone completely, and whoever we became next would be built from the ruins of everything we'd thought we could trust. The community they took us to didn't appear on any map I could find. Nestled in a valley between two mountain ranges in rural Montana, it looked like any other small American town from the highway. A main street lined with local businesses, a school with a playground where children's voices carried on the afternoon breeze, houses with front porches and gardens that suggested people had lived there for generations. But as our convoy passed through what appeared to be a standard highway checkpoint, I noticed details that didn't belong in an ordinary town. The casual way the guards moved, the positioning that provided clear sight lines in all directions, the subtle communications equipment that most travelers would never notice. This wasn't just a place where people lived, it was a place specifically designed to keep certain people safe. Emma pressed her face to the window as we drove down the main street, her excitement returning as she spotted the ice cream shop in the library with colorful banners advertising children's reading programs. After weeks of sterile safe houses and temporary accommodations, the appearance of normal community life seemed to restore some of her natural enthusiasm. "Are we going to live here for a long time?" she asked, turning to look at David and me with the kind of hope that made my chest tight. "We're going to see if it feels like home," I told her, which was as honest as I could be about our situation. The house they'd arranged for us was a 2-story craftsman, with a front porch and a backyard large enough for Emma to play safely. Inside, it had the kind of lived-in comfort that our previous temporary housing had lacked. Furniture that looked like it had been chosen by people who actually planned to use it. Books on the shelves that weren't just decorative. A kitchen with the kind of tools and appliances that suggested someone understood the difference between a temporary stay and a permanent home. Agent Carter introduced us to our liaison, a woman named Patricia who looked like she could have been anyone's favorite aunt. She wore jeans and a sweater that had seen better days, her gray hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, and she moved through our new house with the familiarity of someone who'd done this many times before. "The transition period usually takes about 6 months, Patricia explained as we sat around the kitchen table with coffee and cookies that she'd brought from the local bakery. 6 months to stop looking over your shoulder constantly, to believe that the school bus will actually bring Emma home safely, to sleep through the night without checking the locks twice." She said it with the matter-of-fact tone of someone who understood the specific anxieties that came with living under protection, and I realized that Patricia had probably been through this transition herself. Her easy familiarity with the community, her understanding of the adjustment timeline, suggested personal experience rather than professional training. "How many families live here?" David asked. "Currently 43 families, about 160 people total. The population fluctuates as people arrive and occasionally as they're able to return to their original lives, though that's less common than people initially hope." Less common than people initially hope. The phrase carried implications about the permanent nature of our situation that I wasn't ready to examine too closely. I'd been operating on the assumption that eventually the intelligence threats would be neutralized and we could return to some version of our original life. But Patricia's tone suggested that most families learn to build new lives, rather than waiting for old ones to become safe again. Emma's integration into the community began immediately. The next morning, Patricia walked us to the school, a building that looked like it could have served any small Montana town but had security features that most schools would never need. The principal, a warm woman who introduced herself as Mrs. Rodriguez, seemed genuinely excited to meet Emma and already knew details about her academic progress and interests that must have come from her records in Denver. "We have a wonderful music program," Mrs. Rodriguez told Emma as she showed us around the building. "I understand you were taking piano lessons before you moved here." Emma's face lit up at the mention of music, and for the first time since Christmas morning, she looked genuinely happy rather than just determinedly optimistic. The piano teacher at her new school was a younger woman who spoke enthusiastically about the upcoming spring recital and the music theory games she used to help students understand rhythm and melody. Watching Emma interact with her new teacher, I felt something shift in my chest. Not relief exactly, but a recognition that Emma might actually be able to build a real life in this place rather than just enduring another temporary arrangement. The community had been designed not just for security but for normalcy, for the possibility that children could grow up with stability even if their circumstances were anything but ordinary. My own integration proved more challenging. The job they'd arranged for me was with a small cybersecurity consulting firm that served local businesses and regional government offices. The work was legitimate and used my actual skills, but it felt strange to be using my expertise to protect small-town networks after years of working on sophisticated corporate and defense systems. My supervisor was a man named Tom, who had the easy competence of someone who'd spent decades in technology but preferred the pace of rural life to the pressure of major urban centers. He showed me around the office, introduced me to my colleagues, and explained the client base with the kind of professional enthusiasm that suggested he genuinely enjoyed the work. "Most of our clients are pretty straightforward," Tom explained as we reviewed the project assignments. Local banks, the county government, a few manufacturing companies that need help with compliance requirements. It's not glamorous work, but it's solid, and it makes a real difference for people's daily lives. The description was accurate, but what he didn't mention was that several of the clients were clearly more sophisticated than typical small-town businesses. A consulting firm that specialized in international logistics, a research facility that required security clearances for certain projects, a technology company that developed communications equipment for emergency services. The mix suggested that the community's economy had been carefully structured to provide meaningful employment for people with specialized skills who couldn't return to their original careers. Over the following weeks, I began to understand the intricate balance that made the community function. On the surface, it operated like any small town. People knew their neighbors, children walked to school together, local businesses provided services that met daily needs. But underneath that normalcy was a sophisticated support system designed to help families maintain their safety while building new lives. The community center offered programs that looked standard from the outside, but were actually tailored to the specific needs of families in protection. Counseling services that understood the psychology of identity change, support groups for children who were adjusting to new names and backgrounds, financial planning that accounted for the reality that people's previous assets and credit histories were no longer accessible. Emma thrived in ways that surprised me. Within a month, she had friends who invited her for playdates and included her in birthday parties. Her teacher reported that she was excelling academically and had volunteered to help other students with reading comprehension. The resilience that had helped her survive our initial upheaval seemed to flourish in an environment that provided both security and genuine community. David's adjustment followed a different pattern. His new job with a regional technology firm allowed him to use his cybersecurity expertise, but in applications that were far removed from the classified defense work he'd been doing. The transition seemed to relieve some of the stress he'd been carrying without me realizing it. For the first time in years, he came home from work without the subtle tension that suggested he was mentally reviewing security protocols and threat assessments. I forgot what it felt like to have a job that I could actually talk about at dinner. He told me one evening as we sat on our front porch watching Emma play with neighbor children in the yard across the street. The simple pleasure in his voice made me realize how much the secrecy of his previous work had isolated him, even within our own family. Now he could tell Emma about his projects, explain the problems he was solving, share the satisfaction of work well done without worrying about operational security or classified information. My own adaptation was more complicated. The work itself was satisfying, but I struggled with the sense that I was hiding in plain sight. Everyone in the community was friendly and welcoming, but most conversations felt like performances where we were all carefully avoiding topics that might reveal too much about our previous lives. It was Patricia who helped me understand that the feeling of performing was part of the adjustment process rather than a permanent state. During one of our weekly check-ins, she explained that most people went through a phase of feeling like they were pretending to be someone else before gradually becoming comfortable with their new identity. The key is finding aspects of your new life that feel genuinely yours, she said as we walked through the downtown area on a Saturday morning. Things that aren't just covers or accommodations, but actual interests and relationships that matter to you. For me, that breakthrough came through volunteer work at the community library. The head librarian, a woman named Carol, who had the kind of deep knowledge that comes from decades of connecting people with books, asked if I'd be interested in helping with their digital literacy program for senior citizens. The work involved teaching older community members how to use computers for staying in touch with family, managing finances, and accessing services online. It required patience and the ability to explain technical concepts in simple terms, skills that I developed in my previous career but had never applied to community service. Working with the seniors revealed another layer of the community's complexity. Several of the people in my classes had their own stories of displacement and reinvention, though the details were never explicitly discussed. A woman who seemed remarkably knowledgeable about international finance for someone who claimed to be a retired school teacher. A man whose casual references to various countries suggested extensive travel that didn't match his stated background as a small-town mechanic. The realization that we weren't the only family with complicated histories was both comforting and unsettling. Comforting because it meant we weren't alone in our experience of starting over. Unsettling because it suggested that the threats we'd fled were more widespread than I'd understood. As spring arrived and Emma prepared for her first school recital in our new community, I found myself genuinely excited about an event that belonged to our current life, rather than mourning something from our past. She'd been working on a piece that showcased her developing technical skills while allowing her to express the musical intuition that her teachers consistently praised. The night of the recital, sitting in the school auditorium surrounded by families I was beginning to consider neighbors rather than just fellow refugees, I realized that something fundamental had shifted in how I thought about our situation. We weren't temporarily hiding until our real life could resume. We were building a real life in a place that had been designed to make that possible. Emma's performance was confident and joyful, her face lighting up as she played a melody that she'd practiced for weeks but that now sounded effortless and natural. When she finished and took her bow, the applause from the audience felt like genuine appreciation rather than polite acknowledgement. After the recital, families gathered in the school's multipurpose room for cookies and punch, and I found myself in conversations that felt natural rather than carefully scripted. Parents comparing notes about their children's progress, neighbors planning a community garden project, friends discussing a book club that met monthly at the library. Walking home under a sky brilliant, with stars that were visible because of the community's relative isolation, Emma between David and me chattering about her successful performance and her friends' pieces. I felt something I hadn't experienced since before Christmas morning in Denver. Not just safety or temporary security, but the possibility of a future that belonged to us. That night, after Emma had fallen asleep, still excited about her recital, David and I sat on our front porch and talked about the life we were building. Not the life we'd lost or the life we'd been forced to leave behind, but the actual daily reality of our existence in this protected community. "I never thought I'd say this," David said, his voice carrying a contentment I hadn't heard in months. "But I think we might actually be okay here." Looking out at our quiet street, at the houses where other families were probably having similar conversations about adaptation and acceptance, I realized he was right. We were going to be okay, not because the threats against us had disappeared, but because we'd found a place where it was possible to build something genuine despite those threats. The choice to stop waiting for our old life to become safe again and start investing in our new life felt monumental and surprisingly peaceful. Tomorrow, Emma would go to school where she had friends and teachers who knew her as Lucy Chen, but valued her for qualities that belonged to her, regardless of what name she used. David would continue work that challenged him professionally while allowing him to be fully present with his family. And I would keep building connections in a community that had been designed to help people like us not just survive but thrive. For the first time since Agent Carter had appeared at our door in Denver, I stopped looking backward and started looking forward, ready to see what we could create together in this unlikely sanctuary that had become our home. 5 years later, I stood in the visitor's room of the Federal Correctional Facility in Colorado, separated from my sister Rebecca by reinforced glass and a phone system that crackled with interference. She looked older than her years, her once perfect blonde hair now showing gray roots, her carefully maintained appearance replaced by the institutional uniformity of prison clothing. Emma waited in the car with David, now 11 years old, and confident in ways that came from growing up in a community where she was genuinely safe. She'd asked to come with me for this visit, curious about the aunt she barely remembered, but I'd explained that some conversations were meant for adults only. Rebecca picked up the phone on her side of the glass, and for a moment, we just looked at each other. The sister who had once braided my hair and helped me with math homework, who had also systematically gathered intelligence about my family for foreign operatives who planned to kidnap my daughter. "You look good, Sophia," she said finally, her voice carrying exhaustion that went deeper than physical tiredness. Happy even. "It's Sarah now," I replied automatically, though the name correction felt less important than it once had. "And yes, I am happy." We talked for 20 minutes about surface things, her life in prison, which she described in carefully neutral terms, Emma's academic achievements, which I shared with the pride of any parent, the community where we'd built our new life, though I kept the details vague out of habit rather than necessity. But eventually we reached the conversation we'd both come here to have. I know saying sorry doesn't change anything, Rebecca said, her voice breaking slightly. But I need you to know that I never intended for Emma to get hurt. The plan was supposed to be subtle, something that would make you leave without trauma. I'd rehearsed my response to this moment for months. But sitting across from her, I found that my anger had transformed into something more complex. Not forgiveness exactly, but a recognition that Rebecca's choices had led us to a life that was different from what we'd planned, but not necessarily worse. Emma doesn't remember the slap anymore, I told her truthfully. She remembers Christmas morning as the day our adventure started. She's thriving, Rebecca. She has friends and interests, and a future that's entirely her own. Rebecca's expression crumpled with what might have been relief. And you? Are you really okay? I considered the question seriously. Was I okay? My career had taken a completely different direction, but I found deep satisfaction in work that served my immediate community rather than abstract corporate interests. Emma was growing up with a sense of security that many children never experience. David and I had built a marriage based on complete honesty rather than compartmentalized secrets. I'm more than okay, I said. I'm grateful. The word seemed to surprise both of us. Grateful for betrayal, for upheaval, for years of living under assumed identities? But it was true. The life we'd been forced to build was more authentic than the one we'd lost. When visiting time ended, I walked back to the parking lot where David and Emma were waiting. Emma had finished her homework and was reading a book that her teacher had recommended, completely absorbed in a story about a girl who discovered she had magical abilities she'd never suspected. How did it go? David asked as I settled into the passenger seat. It went exactly how it needed to go, I replied. The drive back to Montana took us through Denver, past the neighborhood where we'd once lived as the Martinez family. I pointed out Emma's old elementary school and the park where she'd learned to ride her first bicycle, treating our previous life like interesting local history rather than a source of loss or regret. Emma listened with the polite attention she gave to any adult's stories about the past, but her real excitement was reserved for plans involving her current life. The science fair project she was developing with her best friend, the summer camp where she'd been accepted into an advanced music program, the high school courses she was already thinking about taking. That evening, as we crossed the state line back into our protected valley, I felt the familiar sense of homecoming that marked the end of any trip. Not relief at returning to safety, but the simple pleasure of returning to a place where we belonged. At Emma's bedtime, she asked the question I'd been expecting all day. Mom, why did Aunt Rebecca do those things that made us have to move? I'd prepared for this moment, consulting with the community counselors about age-appropriate ways to discuss complex adult failures. Sometimes adults make choices based on fear or want rather than love, I explained. Aunt Rebecca was scared about money and made decisions that hurt people she cared about. Emma considered this with the seriousness she brought to complicated questions. But we ended up somewhere good anyway, right? We ended up exactly where we were supposed to be, I assured her. Later, sitting on our front porch in the darkness, David and I watched the lights in our neighbors' windows and listened to the sounds of a community settling in for the night. Children being called inside, dogs barking their evening conversations, the distant hum of the highway that connected our hidden valley to the larger world. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if Rebecca had never been recruited? David asked. I'd thought about that alternate timeline often during our early months here, when I was still mourning our previous life. But tonight the question felt academic rather than painful. We'd probably still be in Denver, I said. Emma would be going to her old school, you'd still be hiding your real work from me, and I'd still be unknowingly involved in classified projects. We'd think we were safe, but we'd actually be vulnerable in ways we couldn't see. The irony wasn't lost on either of us. Rebecca's betrayal had forced us into a life that was more secure, more honest, and more connected to community than anything we'd built on our own. As we prepared for bed, I realized that tomorrow would mark exactly 5 years since Christmas morning in Rebecca's house, since the slap that had set everything in motion. But instead of marking it as an anniversary of trauma, I found myself thinking of it as the day our real life began. Emma fell asleep easily, secure in a home where all the adults around her were exactly who they claimed to be. David and I talked quietly about weekend plans and work projects, the ordinary conversations of people whose lives had found their proper rhythm. And for the first time in years, when I thought about the future, I saw endless possibility rather than potential threat. We had built something genuine from the wreckage of deception, and it belonged completely to us. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.